might be something that I teach in the future, and if anybody has any comments about how to make it better, what worked, what didn't work, please let me know. That will very, and I mean that definitely. I think, I have a vision in my head about this. I'm not sure if I've achieved it. So, the first thing is, when I was putting this class together, when I started thinking about it, what this is a distillation, a actual putting it together. Hello, that's all right. Everyone just stare at you. I was putting things together into a form, taking stuff that I've been doing for years and trying to figure out how to explain it to other people. So this is as much a class for teachers as it is for people who are themselves thinking they're on a plateau or maybe and wanting to get off. Bad choice of words. So, when I started trying to put this together, my first thought was I didn't exactly know what I meant by a plateau. In my mind, it turned out I was referring to like 3 or 4, and then as I sat down and wrote things, 6 or 7 possible things. And each one of these can cause that plateau where the skill builds up. Everyone knows what we're talking about. The basic idea is a buildup of skill to the point where, and then it levels off, and then you're not building in skill anymore, or you feel you're not building in skill anymore. But there are all sorts of different reasons for that, is what I found out. There are all sorts of different types of plateaus. And then I started actually doing some research in cognitive psychology about this, and they don't even know what they're talking about in this area. If anybody wants, I have a bibliography. I didn't bother printing it up. I figured no one cares. But if by any chance anyone does want to read a lot of cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology, I can get you, just email me, I'll get you the bibliography. The first thing that I found when I started looking it up, because I used that formal approach to help me codify what I was thinking, the overwhelming majority of cognitive psychologists think of the plateau as the end result of the 3 stages of skill acquisition. So a little bit, there are 2 spots where I'm going to use some jargon from psychology, and this is one of them. And I'm using this so that I can then refer back to it to point things out. The 3 stages are the cognitive stage, or phase, where you have to, when you're just learning the skill, when you're just starting out, you have to concentrate really hard to figure out what's going on. And you don't necessarily know how to do that, and you're trying to put it together with all sorts of other skills that you're individually concentrating on. We've all been there. We all started fencing at some point. It's okay, I've never done this before. Okay, I now know how to lunge, I now know how to parry, I know about footwork. But I know each one of those independently from the other, and I have to concentrate on each one of those individual things. So that's the cognitive phase. Then after that is the associative. Oh, and the thing that the literature talks about over and over is that the cognitive phase is where the mistakes are made. The majority of mistakes are made there. And it's these mistakes that help learn. We all know that. On some level, we've either had it told to us or we know that it's these mistakes that help us climb up that skill slope. After the cognitive phase is the associative phase. And that is explained by you're making fewer mistakes. We all know that too. Suddenly you're not stumbling over your feet. Suddenly you're able to hit the target or whatever. And you're feeling increasingly comfortable. If you're making less mistakes, you're going to be comfortable with something. Then you also begin to get to that spot where you're just starting to feel the intimations, the very edges of that spot where you don't have to think about it. You're just doing it. But you're still, climbing up that slope. And then the last phase is the autonomous phase. Sorry about that. And that's where you can do the task without thinking. You don't have to think about your feet in relationship to your sword, in relationship to your opponent. You've got distance, you've got timing, you've got these all down. Unfortunately, this is where you can end up getting onto autopilot. And this is where a lot of the literature talks about it as being the okay plateau. By that they mean you're good enough. You think you're good enough. Because you had all these goals, you had these ideas. I don't want to trip. In my case, it was I don't want to fall on my butt. That was my first one. That was my big one. I didn't do it a lot, but I did it a couple times. And I got there, and I was, then it was okay. But the problem is, while you're doing this, you're also, these 3 stages are then repeated. Once you get to the autonomous phase, you start realizing what you don't know, and then you start making the mistakes in the cognitive phase again. It's a constantly repeating process. And every 3rd step after cognitive and associative, you get to the autonomous where, oh, I made it. I made it again. And you can start resting. So that's the literature. That's most of the terminology in the literature. But remember I said they don't even agree on the skill plateau, the cognitive psych people? The people who first wrote that and defined that, 2 years after they wrote that paper, said there are no plateaus. I thought, oh, maybe I'll find some stuff in the literature of the professionals. Yeah, I found a lot of stuff, and it was like that. They'll say, yes, there is, and then they'll say, no, there isn't. But one of the things that I found out while researching is that this is an important topic for people. It's an important topic for us, which is why I thought I'd teach this class, because everybody goes through this. And over and over and over, I found that the cognitive, associative, autonomous, that's applied to any skill, from chess to art to mathematics to science to football to lacrosse to fencing, SCA fencing. So even though they don't agree on anything, really, they agree that this is an important thing to look at. And then it just all sort of falls apart. To put that into another phrase that I found, it's the 4 Ps was mentioned, and I've thought about this. Is in my mind, I thought about this, but I didn't have it put this way. It's practice, progress, peaks, and then plateaus. A plateau comes right after you achieve a goal, usually. You say you want to narrow your target range from about yay, hit something in that target, to something like that. Once you get there, once you achieve a goal that you set for yourself, that is where the plateau sets in, almost always. Now, there are a couple other places that, in my number of years teaching in the SCA, I found that there are also plateaus, and I'll mention those coming along. So, the other things to think about in plateaus. Oh, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask as I go along. I didn't mention that at the start. In my mind, I thought it was assumed, but I just wanted to make sure that it was out there. But there are other ways to get to a plateau, and these are things that I've specifically seen within the SCA. Like I said, I mentioned the jargon, the technical terminology, so that we can put it into a framework that this goes beyond us. This is something that there's a lot written about, and I'm serious, a lot. But within the SCA, and some of these I haven't found corollaries with other activities, but I'm sure there are. One of the things that can result in a plateau, and this was in the jargon called a performance plateau, is simply repeating a skill. If you do something over and over and over and over and over again, you will get that skill. You will if you do. This is one of the bases for modern fencing. You do a parry 4 over and over and over until you got it. What happens in the SCA and what makes this a problem and can lead to a plateau is, in modern fencing, a parry 4 is described within a context. Parry 4, 6, it's not just a lonely thing. Unfortunately, in the SCA, we have a lot of people who are self-taught, And that, I'll mention that in a second. But this, right off the bat, right here, this repetition is a big danger for people who are self-taught. I was largely self-taught when I started out. There were very few of us in Cinnabar. I get to events, but didn't do a lot of practice at events, like fencing. The problem is, if you're just repeating a skill in SEA fencing, you have no context. You mastered that skill, but then you didn't, where do you go from there? That's where a mentor, a teacher, a marshal, or whatever term you want to use it, that's where that comes in. And this is very important, particularly to the teachers in the group. If there are anybody, and I've had people, you know, I offer teaching at Cinnabar. I have people who don't want it, who want to do their own thing. I'm sure people have always existed like that, and we've all seen them. They watch that. They will get frustrated because they will not have the context. They will master, you know, a disengage, a parry riposte or something, a basic disengage, or an outside break, but they won't know what to do with it. And that, in the literature, what happens, and this is particularly mentioned in juvenile sports, this happens a lot, that's called the performance plateau, where they are doing what they think is the right thing. So, from this point down, I'm going to mention a number of ways to get onto a plateau, and then we'll talk about getting off of it. I found when I was putting this together that without knowing how you got there, it's hard to know how to get off. Again, bad choice of words. Now the other thing, and these were listed in my mind as the ones that I ran across most frequently. The next one is not so much a skill plateau as an enjoyment plateau. When you're in a volunteer organization like the SCA, we are play. There are three different, there are two big types of activities, work and play. Work is extrinsically motivated, play is intrinsically motivated. We're here not because somebody somewhere says we have to be here. You work because you need the money to pay the mortgage or whatever. We're here, we're in the SCA specifically because we want to be. It has to be fun or people will leave. And I've had fencers leave because it quit being fun for them. This happens a lot of times when they get to a skill plateau. They don't know how to get off. They don't want to listen to any ideas that I have or anybody else has, and it quits being fun. So this is another area that you have to worry about. Another way you can get onto a plateau is, remember I said a peak, practice, progress, peak? That is, and then it's a period of stability after that. There is no plateaus. When the people say that, what they're meaning is that any practice, anything, even not in context, is still somehow imparting some skill. So when I'm talking about how to take yourself down or off of the plateau and continue improving, realize that at least half of what I'm going to mention is simply pointing out ways in which they are improving, they just didn't know it. Or we've all been there. We were all probably improving, we just didn't know it. And that's a stability plateau. The next one that I ran across a lot was a resource limitation. In the SCA, that's most common, or most easily seen with heavy fighters. Once you get armor that fits and you're not wearing that really bad loner gear, you suddenly skyrocket. Everybody skyrockets right at that point. And that's because they can move. The resource being the armor is no longer limiting them. The most common thing I've seen in the SCA fencing world are, we have a lot of undergraduate women, and a lot of them are, say, yay tall, weigh about 95 pounds or so, and they're trying to use my big 42-inch sword that's way too heavy, and they can't use it. They can't do things. They can move it, they're slow, And so this is a resource limitation. Now, the way to deal with this specifically, and I'm just going to do this as an aside because this is one that comes up so much, teachers, watch for this. You were nodding your head. You've come across this. You have to, because this is fun, and because we all have these dreams in our heads about jumping in and being great, I don't know about any of you, but I've jumped in way too deep. I've gone in and started doing things. I've got golfer's elbow, bowler's knee, you know, all this other sports injuries, because I didn't work up to the musculature that I needed. That was the same thing. I limited how quickly I could rise, and so there were times I was very frustrated because I was hurting myself. So that is another way to get onto this plateau. Closely related to that is we've had one fencer in Cinnabar who had a bad knee. She couldn't bend much more than this. So once she got to the point where lunges or lateral steps or anything like that was going, she hit a plateau. And that was a physical physical injury, put a ceiling on her until we sat and thought about it. The one thing about the SCA that is so much better than period fencing, is they won't kick you out at that point. I don't know how many people in here have done period fencing. I have. And if you had a bad knee, you were off the club. There was just no choice. You couldn't play it anymore. Yeah?
In 2008, I blew out the ACL in my right knee. For the interim between the diagnosis and getting it resolved, I fought from a sitting position.
Yep.
Brought out a chair for practice. It really brought it home to me distance and how far I could reach and not running my opponent down just to get at them. I had to wait. I had to learn patience and learn to wait for them to come to me.
Yep. And that is exactly some of the stuff I'm going to come up to in a second, and I'll mention that. But the SCA, there are optimal ways of doing things. There aren't only ways of doing things. As long as there are some groups that disagree with me, but they're not here. So that's another way of getting onto a plateau. And a very, very insidious one that, as I was thinking about this, came up. I haven't experienced this myself, but I know other groups have. And it's a social plateau. It's where you've got 4 or 5 friends and your buds, and you fence together. And you get as good as you want to be as a group. And then you stop. And you feel pressure to hang out with them instead of coming to practice, or sit at practice and talk. And I've seen that at other groups. It's particularly bad in households sometimes. Yeah, very much with cliques, very much with households. So that social plateau, or the social aspect, can cause a plateau. And that's, in my mind, that would be the hardest one to deal with. Both as someone who is coming to me as a marshal, saying I have a problem, and then my diagnosis is, because that's what this is, how to continue off the plateau. And the skill thing is often a diagnosis of what is the problem. And if it was a social thing, that to me would be the hardest. I haven't had to deal with that yet, but there are some ways I've thought about, and I'm moderately prepared. So, so those are the 7 or 8 basic ideas of how to plateau that I've run across in the SCA. I'm sure there are others. This isn't by no means all. This is what I've thought about. This is what I've experienced and what I've heard of. And just seconds ago, I mentioned that the first step, the first idea is of how to do this is to diagnose which of these, because not every plateau is the same. Everyone's as frustrating, particularly to the person there. It's frustrating to me as a teacher. It's very frustrating to me as a teacher. But that first step that I have to do is a diagnosis, is to try and figure out how did you get there. Is your equipment not appropriate for you? Are your friends influencing you poorly? You know, have you just been ignoring everything I've said and doing your own thing out there and, you know, just rope practice yourself into a dead end? There are some ways of, some hints of figuring this out if you're on my end, on the teacher's end. There are also hints and ways of doing this if you're on the frustrating end, if you're on the person who's trying to figure out what's going on, what happened, what went wrong. The first thing, the first thing and the hardest thing, and again, this is something that we all know, nothing went wrong. You're where you're supposed to be. If you're on a plateau, that means you achieved some goals. You made a success. Okay, now you got to make the next one. And this okay, hold on. I'm going to, let's see. Okay, I didn't drink at all while I was fencing today, sorry. Yes, it was bad. Yeah, don't tell Bertha. So, it starts with having no clue. The very first step, bang, you're on a plateau. You've been showing great promise. You've been getting better. And this happens to everybody, every step of the way. Because all it is a repetition of those 3 states that I mentioned earlier. You achieved a goal. You managed to get through the spot you were making all the mistakes. You managed to start making fewer mistakes. Had to think about it less. You were incorporating it into your normal activities as a fencer. And then you didn't even have to think about it, or think about it very poorly. Or, like me, think about it and then get killed. But that's how you got there. That's how you got there. The very first thing, and it's easy for me to say as a teacher, it's real easy for me to say as a teacher is, congratulations, you're on a plateau. Good for you. Bravo. It's not so easy to hear if you're the person there. And no one said that to me, and I imagine it wouldn't be easy for me, even though I said it to a lot of other people, because it's so frustrating. But that's the very first trick, before you even try to figure out how to get off, is to remove yourself from that issue. Getting back to the cognitive psych stuff, the idea of removing yourself from a plateau and continuing on in skill is, I had to translate, sorry about this. Why I'm hesitating here and having a hard time speaking is, I have to translate from what they're doing, what their world they're talking about is, to our world. Because they're talking about something called deliberate practice. And that's a phrase that comes up over and over and over again. Has anybody heard the popular notion, it's around, I had heard it before I did this, that it takes 10,000 hours to master a skill? I don't know if anyone here has heard that, but the idea is to master a skill, to be at the professional level, takes 10,000 hours of doing that skill. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I'm maybe at 2,000 hours. Maybe. The first inkling I had that the SCA approach and world was different from the professional world, the world outside of this, was when I had to start thinking about drills in the sense of modern fencing drills, doing them at practice. There are pros and cons of both. I talked to my old fencing teacher years ago. This was about 6 years ago when it first came up. No, more like 8 years ago. I talked to my old fencing teacher and explained the situation. We have a 4-hour practice once a week. Most people will fence maybe an hour and a half. 2 hours, 2.5 hours for the really motivated ones. And then the ones who really have been doing this a long time, we'll get to maybe 3 hours. And he said, don't do drills. It's just going to confuse people. When I was in the fencing club, we had 8 hours of drills a week. And he said that was barely a minimum. And we did 8 hours of drills a week. We were doing deliberate practice. And the thing about deliberate practice is that's what hardcore athletes do. That's what modern fencers do. It's not supposed to be fun. It is the opposite of play. It is the opposite. It's not work exactly. It's a third category, but it is not what the SCA is for most people. And so I had to start thinking that, okay, that's how you get off the plateau for a lot of modern fencers. The way that they talk about getting off a plateau, the easiest way, push yourself through it. If you're good, you're going to get through it, and you're going to just go on. What they say is, okay, the specific things about how to, for a sport, modern athlete, and some of this is applicable to us. To get off that plateau, you slow down. But you don't stop. You do the exact same number of hours. You just concentrate a lot more. You get back to the basics. If you're having, say you're an intermediate SA fencer, you slow down, you go back to thinking about your parries, thinking about your footwork. This is stuff that you had probably been doing for a couple of years or more. And then you push it. You slow down, you think about that, and then you push it. In the same amount of time, the next step is to go 2 or 3 times as fast. Keeping this concentration, keeping these basics in mind. And that is deliberate practice. It's hard. It wears you out. It has destroyed professional careers because you never know when your body's going to break, particularly if you're a professional athlete. One of the essays I read was about high school pitchers, and they're throwing their shoulders out before they get to college because they're doing deliberate practice. They're throwing 2 times, 3 times as fast, as hard as they did, and they're blowing their shoulders out. So this is not fun. It's specifically not fun. It works for some people. So that was the first thing I came across when I looked into this on how to get off of the plateau. The next thing I had to do was how to figure out to make this applicable to the SCA, particularly the SCA fencing. Like I said, some of it is. Getting back to the basics. However you got onto that plateau, whether it was a social situation, whether it was a performance gear situation, once you resolve that issue, the first step is to resolve that issue. You'll never get off that plateau if you're allowing yourself to constantly be forced back on by your friends. You may go back to 2 more practices, but then you quit hanging, and you'll start hanging out on the edge with your friends. That's just going to happen. You have to realize if you've got the frustration of being on the plateau in that situation versus the fun. Sometimes you can't get off. If you are in that situation as a teacher, if you find someone who's very frustrated, they're just not getting any better, and it turns out to be something like that, or it turns out to be a physical issue. I have a load of physical issues. I've had to learn how to deal around all of this. And I managed. It was frustrating. It was hard. But I did it. I stuck through it. It wasn't fun. It wasn't even a little bit fun for a lot of that. I got stubborn. So, hold on, I lost my place. Okay. So after you find out what type of plateau you're on, you have to start figuring out how to get off of it. The deliberate effort, deliberate play